As part of winterizing the house this fall, I wanted to go ahead and replace these plastic downspout extensions with something a bit more functional. In the past couple of years, I've come to find that these plastic ones are a bit of a temporary solution at best. If you don't screw them into the elbow, the wind can just whip them away, which oftentimes happens in the lead up to a rainstorm. And then when you do screw them down, you still end up having to bend them out of the way whenever it's time to mow. This eventually stresses out the plastic, and you end up with cracks and have to replace them within just a few years' time. They also lay flat against the ground and kill any grass growth underneath. And while I did bury one a few years back using PVC and then a cleanout cap at the end, the remaining 3 aren't in areas with any grading issues, so I thought I would try to keep it simple and just install some hinging aluminum extensions. So when I went online, I found this very popular flip-up hinge from Gutterworks that had some great reviews. It was listed just under $9, but then when Amazon added on another $9 for shipping, it got me to thinking, if I'm going to have to cut the aluminum for these and make some adjustments to the gutter elbows to do this installation anyway, why not just hit one of these $2 spring hinges with some brown spray paint, fix it onto the end of the elbow, and call it a day? I was also curious to whether or not the spring action in this hinge would be strong enough to effectively soften the fall of the downspout when it's released from being pinned against the side of the gutter. If it can prevent the thing from slamming against the ground like you get with just a basic zip screw fix like you see here, then this would hopefully preserve the integrity of the connection for a long time. Not to mention immediately elevate me to coolest homeowner on the block status, with the world's first and only soft close downspout extension hinge. But before we get to replacing and testing the 2 front yard extensions, I want to mention that I elected for a simple zip screw solution for this out of sight, out of mind backyard extension. But as you see, the amount of movement on this option puts a lot of stress on those 2 screws, which can tend to get stripped and will need to be replaced. If you can be fairly delicate with it and don't have anyone hitting it with a mower, this method is still much longer lasting than the plastic versions and very easy to install. I'll quickly walk you through how to make and install this one. But if you are just here to see the 2 sturdier solutions with the built-in hinges, you can skip ahead to the chapter that starts at 4 minutes and 39 seconds. Okay, so here we are in the downspout aisle of my local box store, and they make it very tempting to just grab one of these quick and easy options rather than carry out a 10-foot run of aluminum. But we know that we are just going to be back here in a year or 2 if we go with this quick fix again. At one point, I was very tempted by this flipper dripper actually, but it only extends a few feet, so you're really not taking the water very far from your foundation. I should also mention that unless you have a vehicle in which you can fit all 10 feet of the aluminum extension, you'll want to measure out your final downspout lengths before you head to the store so you can cut them to size before you load up. I've seen a few stores with a hacksaw somewhere near the lumber section, but just in case they don't, be sure to bring your own so you can quickly do this in the parking lot. I'll link mine in the description, but if you don't have one, you can even just pierce the thing with a utility knife and then use a tin snips like you see me doing here. If you go with this option, keep in mind that the initial cut will be pretty jagged, especially if you only have a single tin snips like me, so you're going to want to give it another trim to get that nice clean edge. Make sure you throw on some gloves to protect your hands here. Once your cut looks good, go ahead and hit this with some 100 grit sandpaper to get rid of any remaining sharp edges. As I'm incredibly cheap, I'm using an extra sanding disc that I had lying around, but hey, it gets the job done. Once everything is smoothed out, you'll want to figure out exactly where on the gutter elbow you can attach the 2 zip screws and still maintain a full range of motion to get the extension all the way up and down, but also have it cover far enough underneath the elbow while it's at rest to prevent any leaking. On this 2x3 inch elbow, just to be safe, I decided to cut between 3 and 4 inches of clearance out of the extension. Even though I'm working with just a right-handed tin snips here, I've found that if I work in smaller sections, taking the time to bend the cut portions out of the way and then finish off my rough cut with a small trim to clean things up, you can still arrive at a pretty decent result. Just don't forget to give it a good sanding like we did before, and you should be ready to go ahead and drill the thing right where you marked it. I'm using these zip screws here that I will link in the description. I've also heard of people swapping in a couple of pop rivets as a super durable hardware option, but I unfortunately do not own a pop rivet tool. Okay, with this one done, we are on to install the flip-up hinge from Gutterworks. So while this one was definitely the most expensive of all the options in this video, I was not at all disappointed with the build quality while unboxing. It's very sturdy, powder-coated to resist rust and corrosion, and comes with not only this catch to hold the top of the downspout while you have it up, but also matching painted zip screws, as well as directions for the installation. Speaking of the directions, Gutterworks recommends that you out a 3-inch notch from the extension, and that you make this cut at around a 45 to 47 degree angle. Now, just about everyone that I saw install this one online made more of a scoop to get better coverage rather than just a straight cut, but I thought I would at least make sure and start my angle at 45 degrees, even if I did end up leaving a bit more onto the end. They also recommend placing the elbow 12 inches above sod. This creates an optimal descent angle for any water or debris flowing through. I actually needed to shorten the gutter and place the elbow a little higher. If it turns out that you also need to adjust the height, just be sure that you are connecting the elbow over top of the extension so that you get some overlap and everything ends up watertight. Another great feature of this product that makes the installation so easy is how they build these little latches into each side of the hinge so that you can literally just let it sit there as you screw everything together. Some of the other popular zip hinge products that I found online are engineered without this and seem like they would be much more awkward to get on and all squared up. Just about every one of them is a two-piece solution as well, further complicating the installation. One word of caution with the installation of this one, though, is that once I had installed it as per the manufacturer's instructions, I noticed there was still a decent gap between the elbow and the extension. As I wasn't in love with the look of that, I decided to test it with a full hose of water coming down the gutter, and sure enough, I saw a decent amount of water escaping. So I took the thing off and cut about a 3/4-inch notch out of the part of the elbow that holds the hinge, and when I tested it again, the problem was solved. If I were able to get away with a slightly shorter run of downspout here, or move the elbow even further up the gutter, then I could have also made that angle tighter without having to re-drill it, but I guess that's why they say, measure once, cut twice, right? So just know that the manufacturer's recommendation of 12 inches from the sod is definitely more of a ballpark number, and expect to adjust the elbow higher or lower, depending on both the length of extension, as well as the low point of the grade, where the extension makes contact with your lawn. And honestly, I would have probably still cut in that gap a ½ inch or so, as I want to make this one particularly gusher-proof, as this is by far the flattest grade of the three that we're working on today. Okay, so on to the fun one. We've got this ½ inch spring hinge here in order to hold the extension to the elbow, and instead of using zip screws, as we're going to need a little more hold, I'll be screwing in these number 1032 TPI ½ inch machine screws and bolts. We need something about the same size as a zip screw, as you don't want the hardware on the inside of the downspout to be any bigger, as then you run the risk of it obstructing debris and leaves and clogging things up, so these are a perfect size. Now, so they're not just skating around in there, and also to reinforce a larger area of the aluminum around either side of the hinge with something more than a few washers, I decided to cut a pair of shims to be held inside of each side of the downspout using these bidirectional composite shims. As these are bidirectional, in order to create something that would sit flat, I glued a few together with some JB Weld plastic bonder and let them dry overnight. Once I had measured and cut them to spec, as well as drilled out my pilot holes to match the hinge, this is what I was left with. So it was time to get back outside and get this thing fitted onto the elbow. I ended up cutting a pretty steep angle onto the extension, as it was necessary to really snug it up close to the elbow, as this particular spring hinge was not super deep. I also had to crimp the inside of the elbow quite a bit to both prevent against leaks and also make sure that neither side is catching when we're raising and lowering the extension. They actually make a really nice 5-blade downspout crimping tool if you want to end up with something that looks more like this, but I was using my good old needle nose, and this thing wasn't in great shape to begin with either.
Bruh.
Once I had the shim taped in there, it was time to drill baby drill. Getting a needle nose on the end of those bolts to hold them in place was a bit awkward, but ended up very happy with the amount of grip we ended up getting on that joint. But as elegant of a fix as this turned out being, the real question was, would it pass the hose test? And after setting up the camera and confusing my neighbors even more by spraying a garden hose up onto the roof, you can see that once again, we ended up with a very functional solution. So now the question is, was it worth it paying close to $20 for the Gutterworks option versus just creating this spring hinge version on my own for the cost of a $2 hinge and a few dollars worth of hardware and shims? If we're being honest, and if I had to do it all over again, I would 100% buy the Gutterworks option every time, as the ease of installation probably saved me about an hour. When you factor in all the additional pilot holes, gluing and cutting the shims, painting the components, etc. Also, with whatever spring hinge option that you put in there, at the end of the day, you're going to want it weak enough to allow the downspout to fully extend when at rest, so you are going to be somewhat limited in terms of the amount of soft clothes action that you can get with something like this. Well, that's it for this one. I went ahead and left a link for the Gutterworks option in the description. And if you've made it this far into the video, please consider subscribing and allowing notifications, as it really helps out the channel. Thanks.